The second part of our author's method was to show that sacramental fast and Thanksgiving days are contrary to the judgment of almost the whole Christian Church. This was an arduous task. How is it executed? Part of it lies in setting the confession and directory to rights, for they seemed rather to grant too much on the opposite side. Most unquestionably, he has failed to show that the days in dispute are contrary to their doctrine or prescriptions. To prove his point, he ought to have shown not that the days had no existence in foreign churches, nor at home till of late, some still after 1645. For this might well be the case, and yet the Church entertained no judgment contrary to them. Not that no mention is made of them in the different confessions he has appealed to, for how was it to be expected, if they were not existent, when these confessions were written? Not that no law has been made by the Church about them, for such a law would not have been made even though the Church had been favorable to them, and engaged in the practice, because it would have been beside the written word, would have seemed to constitute them holidays. But he ought to have shown that the principles hitherto maintained by the Reformed churches and published in their confessions are contrary to the practice. Some specimens of the little that bears on this point we have already remarked, particularly his attempt to support the proposed new measure by the doctrine of the Westminster Confession about ordinary parts of worship, and to reconcile with this doctrine as explained by him the words of the Directory, where the administration of the sacrament is allowed to be a special occasion and classed with public fastings and thanksgivings. The term special, he observes, is indefinite. When applied to the Lord's Supper, as in the Directory, it merely distinguishes this from other duties. Letter page 87. He should have told us in what respects. Perhaps that sacrament is so very special as even to warrant a previous fast. The distinction he refers to cannot surely mean nothing more than the notice of a difference between the Lord's Supper and preaching, for instance, as one ordinance is distinguished from another by its name or form. Were this all, the craving a blessing to our meat might also be denominated special, to distinguish it from sacramental service. Other passages in our own and foreign confessions to which he has appealed are granted by himself to have been framed solely against the Romish rites and superstitious appendages to the sacrament, which are utterly unwarranted by Scripture. Letter page 82. Though Mr. Mason has succeeded in proving that our fast and Thanksgiving days are on a level with such rites, he could have brought out the judgment of the Church against us only by inference. It was too much, then, to set out with a bold assertion that these days are contrary to the judgment of the Christian Church, as if the whole current of public sentiment expressed in solemn actions, etc., had been diametrically opposite to them. He found it expedient to soften down the contrariety first intended to be proved into it was not the judgment of the Church for a long series of ages such days should be observed. By this he has sheltered himself a little, for the fact is, during these ages the Church gave no judgment on the subject, nor any that can by implication be made to apply. The third part of our author's method was to exhibit the great and serious evils with which sacramental fasts and thanksgivings are attended. Most of the supposed evils have already fallen under consideration. Section 5 in the objections against the Presbyterian plan, which are adduced chiefly from Mr. Mason's work. Under the 4 propositions of that section, the reviewer conceives he has sufficiently repelled the allegations that these days are an unwarranted addition to the ordinance of the supper, that they involve us in self-contradiction, and that they tend to banish the principle and practice of scriptural fasting and thanksgiving. A little attention to the observations subjoined in the section may correct the mistake with which Mr. Mason sets out in specifying the evils, that the days in question establish a term of communion which has no scriptural sanction. Enough has been said also in the pernicious distinction supposed to be created between the two sacraments by our plan. Whether the observance of days of fasting and thanksgiving be unfriendly to pure and evangelical devotion can scarcely be determined by reasoning. The legal disposition will endeavor to convert everything of which it can take advantage to its purpose. And does Mr. Mason apprehend no danger of an abuse of weekly communicatings by that disposition? These, one would imagine, might furnish it with the plea of even works of supererogation. But due care may be taken to guard Christians from supposing that our preparatory services mean we must work harder in order to our acceptance in the supper. Evangelical ministers are not usually so inattentive to the legal spirit as to neglect the requisite cautions. If, however, that spirit be so predominant in the present age as Mr. Mason seems to insinuate, there is the more need for previous fasting to humble ourselves before the Lord, for serious self-examination, for all the public aid and direction by which, under the blessing of God, Christians may be enabled to set forward, in the strength of the Lord, making mention of his righteousness only, in an observance more explicitly declarative of faith in Jesus than attendance on the common dispensation of grace. One of the evils specified we have shown to be a special advantage of our plan. It is the communion of the ministry. Our numerous services, says Mr. Mason, render the dispensation of the supper almost impracticable to any minister without the aid of his brethren. See on the subject Section 5, Proposal 2, third point. At the same time, it ought to be recollected that we are not so tied down to the plan usually formed as to be bound by it in all cases and circumstances. Where extensive fellowship or ministerial aid can seldom be attained, the sacrament may be more frequently dispensed than would otherwise be proper, and, even though the public services should be abridged and, on some occasions, laid aside. In his letter, Mr. Mason brings forward the advantages of his proposed but undeterminate measure, frequent communion. These we might dismiss with the single remark that if the measure be wrong, we must not do evil that good may come. On surveying, however, the advantages held out, we are at a loss to conceive how he would appropriate them to his plan. Some of them seem to be equally, if not better, attained by the mode we defend. It is certainly better calculated for promoting and confirming brotherly love than the scheme of weekly dispensation, but in general more of the divine countenance may be expected to a mode is which suited to the design of the ordinance than to one which either overlooks or counteracts any of its ends. We too might specify advantages, and some that are peculiar to our method, besides the consolation we have of treating the ordinance with due respect according to its nature and ends, and of endeavoring to secure right observance in a degenerate age. A proper interval is allowed by our plan for the manifestation of regard to vows, or following up and verifying the solemn profession made. The period during which the ordinance may be considered as producing its fruits and displaying its effect, is not needlessly prolonged. While none will pretend that constant observance would keep alive a spiritual frame, solemn dispensation, recurring at intervals, may be expected to arouse the languid, to revive attention to the state of the soul, to excite peculiar interest, and lead to beneficial reflections on past conduct. But instead of enlarging on advantages, a theme apt to build the mind to just views and solid reasoning, the true supports of any mode of religious worship, we conclude by specifying two disadvantages under which the independent plan obviously labors, and of which ours is happily clear. By weekly communion, the Christian Sabbath is converted into a constant festival. Something is thus added to or superintended on the Lord's Day. It is made the stated memorial at once of his death and resurrection. There is a change effected upon it, at least beside the written word. To this the judgment of the Reformed churches is manifestly hostile. They allowed that fasting was not improper on Sabbath, and in various instances actually kept the first day of the week as a fast. But a fast and a festival or feast never can be combined, and to the friends of weekly communion, particularly, fasting must appear utterly incapable of combining with the observance of the supper. In fine, if that ordinance, was intended to be kept every first day of the week, it will be difficult to free Paul from granting some kind of allowance to neglect it, or at least supposing it might warrantably be omitted. Were the same language adopted with respect to the Sabbath, as often as you keep the first day of the week, etc., who would not instantly conclude that stated observance was not expected?